Racist police officer stops black man, only to discover he's the head of internal affairs. It was a hot morning in Atlanta, with the sun gleaming off the asphalt of I-285. Officer Rick Calloway, a veteran of the police force, was on patrol. Rick had a reputation, known for his strict demeanor, sometimes even condescending. He often seemed harsher with drivers of darker skin tones. "I have to be tough to maintain order," he often said. As he cruised down the highway, Rick noticed a black SUV driving slightly over the speed limit. He turned on his squad car's lights and followed the vehicle. Pulling over behind the SUV, he adjusted his belt and glanced in the rearview mirror. "Let's see what we've got here," he muttered. Approaching the car, he saw a black man in his 40s wearing an impeccable suit. The man appeared calm, but there was something about the way he gripped the steering wheel. An unusual confidence, Rick thought. Rick tapped the window with his flashlight. "License and registration," he said firmly, ignoring the polite greeting from the driver. The man, whose ID badge on the dashboard read David Brooks, replied calmly, "Of course, officer. It's in the glove compartment. May I retrieve it?" Rick nodded, his tone cold. When David handed over the documents, Rick frowned. "Mr. Brooks, do you know why I pulled you over?" David looked directly at Rick without hesitation. "Perhaps for the speed limit, or maybe because I'm a black man driving an expensive car." "Which one is it?" Rick hadn't expected that. His face tightened, though he tried to maintain control. "Sir, don't tell me how to do my job," he replied, though his voice wavered slightly. After running the documents through the system, Rick found everything was in order. No tickets, no irregularities. However, one detail stood out. David's employer ID number was linked to the Atlanta Police Department. Rick returned to the SUV, his suspicion mounting. "What exactly do you do at the police department?" he asked, trying not to betray his unease. David smiled enigmatically. "I work with integrity, officer. I'm sure you understand the importance of that." Rick's stomach tightened. Something was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. As Rick pondered, flashes from his past crossed his mind. He remembered an internal conduct investigation years ago in which his name had almost come up. He'd narrowly escaped back then, but he knew someone in the department had been keeping a close eye on him since. The radio in Rick's squad car interrupted his thoughts. "Rick, we need you at the station as soon as you're done. The chief wants an immediate meeting," said the familiar voice of the dispatcher. Rick dismissed David, though not without a final warning. "Mr. Brooks, take care. We don't want any trouble." David responded with a meaningful look. "Certainly, officer. Trouble only comes when we don't follow the rules." Later that day, hours after the highway incident, Rick arrived at the station, still unsettled. He headed straight to the meeting room, where Police Chief Frank Daniels waited, looking grim. Upon entering, Rick noticed he wasn't the only one summoned. Several other officers were there, their expressions a mix of confusion and apprehension. "Gentlemen," Daniels began, rapping the table, "we need to have a serious discussion. Internal Affairs is conducting an audit, and I expect full cooperation from all of you." Rick froze. He was well aware of Internal Affairs' reputation. They were relentless in uncovering even the smallest secrets. But it was Daniels' next words that hit him like a ton of bricks. "And leading this audit is David Brooks." Rick felt sweat trickle down his temple. This has to be a coincidence, he thought, though deep down he knew it wasn't. Moments later, the meeting room door opened, and in walked David Brooks, the same man Rick had pulled over that morning. David entered with the demeanor of someone in complete control. He scanned the room, offering a polite but unsmiling nod. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," he began. "I'm here to ensure this department meets the standards we've promised to our community." Rick avoided making eye contact with David, but could feel the weight of his gaze. "This can't be personal," Rick told himself. "He can't know about that." As David detailed the audit's objectives, Rick's mind drifted to the incident that had almost ended his career. It involved excessive force against a young black man during a traffic stop. Despite incriminating evidence, Rick had been shielded by a colleague who manipulated the report. Since then, Rick had carried the weight of the incident, alongside a sense of invincibility. "If they find out about that, I'm done," he thought, his trembling fingers adjusting his tie. When the meeting ended, David approached Rick directly. "Officer Calloway, May I have a word with you? Rick tried to maintain his composure. Of course, Mr. Brooks. David escorted Rick to an interrogation room, closed the door, and sat down. You know why I'm here, don't you? David asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and provocation. Rick feigned ignorance. You're here to ensure the department is clean, right? David gave a slight smile, but his gaze remained fixed. Correct. But there's an interesting detail. Did you know that one of our biggest cases involves an excessive force incident you were involved in? Rick's heart began to race. He tried to respond, but his words came out stammered. No, that was investigated at the time, and everything was in order. David leaned forward. Yes, it was. But you know something curious about the truth, Officer Calloway? It has a habit of surfacing, no matter how deeply we try to bury it. Behind his cold professionalism, David carried his own scars. He hadn't told anyone, but his determination to expose injustices was personal. Years earlier, his younger brother Marcus had been the victim of similar police abuse. David had never gotten over the fact that those responsible had walked away unpunished. Deep down, every case David investigated was a step toward honoring Marcus's memory. And now, sitting across from Rick, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of justice. David stood adjusting his tie. Officer Calloway, I'll do my best to ensure you have the chance to share your side of the story. But I'll warn you, if there's anything you're hiding, now would be the time to speak up. Rick kept his expression neutral, but inside he was panicking. I have nothing to hide, he said, his voice trembling slightly. David didn't respond immediately. He simply smiled, a cryptic smile. I hope not. See you later, officer. The anonymous email. Hours later, as Rick was reviewing his reports at the precinct, an anonymous email arrived at the department's central computer. The subject line read, Evidence on Calloway, John Daniels case. Rick saw the alert on the screen, felt a chill run down his spine, and instantly knew his life was about to unravel. The precinct was quiet, except for the distant sounds of ringing phones and crackling radios. Rick stared at the computer screen, where the email subject line pulsed like a grim reminder of his past. Evidence on Calloway, John Daniels case. His fingers hovered over the mouse, hesitating. Who would send this, he thought. The John Daniels case had been buried years ago, or so he believed. With a click, Rick opened the message. The email contained a link to a video. The description read, Security camera footage, September 15th, John Daniels case. Rick clicked the link, and his heart sank as the familiar scene unfolded. It was the exact moment he shoved John Daniels, an unarmed black man, against the hood of a car with unnecessary force. The audio captured Daniels' cries of protest and the insults Rick, out of control, hurled at him. This will destroy me, he murmured as sweat dripped from his forehead. David receives the information. Across town, David Brooks was in his apartment, reviewing audit reports. His phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. Watch this. It'll be useful for your investigation. A friend from the department. David opened the attachment, and his blood ran cold as he watched the same video. He had known the department was troubled, but seeing that level of abuse on tape reignited painful memories of his brother Marcus. He took a deep breath. This is it. There's no more doubt. Calloway needs to be held accountable. The first direct confrontation. The next day, David summoned Rick to a private meeting in the interrogation room. The atmosphere was tense, with fluorescent lights flickering faintly. David slid a tablet across the table, displaying the video to Rick. Care to explain this, Officer Calloway? David asked, his voice firm but not aggressive. Rick tried to keep his composure. That was years ago. The case was resolved. I was under pressure, and he resisted arrest. David crossed his arms. Resisted? Because what I see here is an unarmed man being humiliated and assaulted. That's not how we treat the citizens we swear to protect. You don't understand the context. Rick shot back, his voice rising a notch. I did what I thought was necessary to maintain order. David leaned in. Context is irrelevant when human dignity is violated. This isn't just about you, Calloway. It's about a system that fails to hold its own accountable. David, however, was battling his own demons. As he reviewed the case, he couldn't stop thinking about Marcus. His brother had been beaten by officers during a routine stop. He had survived physically but was never the same. The injustice had eaten away at his will to live, leading to a tragic end. The pain of losing Marcus was what drove David to be so relentless. But as he looked into Rick's eyes, he saw something unexpected: fear. Not just the fear of being caught, but something deeper. Does he feel guilt? David wondered. A meeting with an old partner. Later that night, Rick went to a dimly lit bar, where he met his former partner, Mike. Mike was the officer who had helped him manipulate the report in the Daniels case. "Rick, what's going on?" "You're acting strange," Mike said, taking a sip of his beer. Rick ran his hands through his hair. "They have the video, Mike. If this gets out, we're screwed." "You too." Mike shrugged. "Relax. No one's going to care. The system's on our side, remember? It always has been." Rick shook his head. "You don't understand. This guy Brooks, he's different. He won't stop until he brings everything down." Meanwhile, David found himself at a moral crossroads. His boss, Captain Laura Martinez, called him in for a private conversation. "David, I've heard you're investigating the Calloway case," she began. "I just want to remind you that sometimes pursuing justice can bring political consequences for the department, especially if you go after someone with so many years of service." David understood what she was implying. "Captain, with all due respect, my job isn't to protect egos or reputations. It's to ensure justice is served." Martinez sighed. "I know, David. Just be careful. You're dealing with forces bigger than you realize." The video leaks. The next day, the video from the Daniels case was leaked to the press. Within hours, it was all over the headlines. Police abuse. Explosive footage of Calloway case. David was in his office when he saw the news. He hadn't leaked the video, but he knew it would change everything. Meanwhile, Rick watched the coverage with a knot in his stomach. The journalist spared no detail, and his career was officially in ruins. David held a press conference declaring, "The Atlanta Police Department does not tolerate abuse of power. We are conducting a full investigation and guarantee complete transparency." Rick knew this was only the beginning. Rick's desperation. Back at his apartment, Rick opened a bottle of whiskey, trying to silence the chaos in his mind. After a few gulps, he picked up the phone and called Mike. "Mike, we need to act. This Brooks, he needs to be stopped." David's resolve. Across town, David was on the phone with his boss, firmly stating, "Calloway must be held accountable, but I won't cross ethical lines to do it." Two men, on opposing paths, were preparing for their final confrontation. The final showdown. It was a rainy night in Atlanta. The police department's parking lot was empty except for two cars, one belonging to Rick Calloway, the other to David Brooks. Inside the interrogation room, the two faced each other once again. "You have no idea what you're up against, Brooks," Rick said, his voice filled with anger and desperation. "I gave my life to this department, and you want to destroy me over a mistake I made years ago." David crossed his arms, his face expressionless. "This isn't about you, Calloway. It's about justice. It's about a system that needs to change. And if you stand in the way of that change, then yes, you will be held accountable." Rick slammed his hand on the table, losing his patience. "You don't get it. You think it's that simple, but out there on the streets, it's chaos. You have to make tough decisions. Not everything is black and white." David remained calm, but his words were sharp. And it's that mentality that leads to tragedies like Marcus. Rick looked confused. "Marcus? Who's Marcus?" David looked directly at him. "My younger brother. He was brutalized by cops like you. They said he resisted. They said it was a mistake. But that didn't bring my family back to normal. It didn't bring him back." The silence in the room was deafening. A conspiracy unfolds. Meanwhile, in the back of the precinct, Mike was holding a secret meeting with two other veteran officers. "This Brooks guy is going too far," Mike said. "If he keeps pushing, not only will Rick go down, but all of us will. We need to do something." The other officers nodded in agreement. "We have to find a way to discredit him. Something from his past we can use." Mike lit a cigarette, deep in thought. "If we can't find anything, we'll make something up." An anonymous tip. That same night, as David was reviewing more reports, he received an anonymous call. Brooks, I have something that might interest you. It's about Rick Calloway, a secret he doesn't want anyone to know. David hesitated, but decided to meet the source. At the agreed location, a deserted parking lot, a hooded man handed him a folder. This is everything you need. Good luck. Before David could ask more, the man disappeared into the rain. Back in his office, David opened the folder. Inside were documents about the Daniels case, but also something unexpected. Financial records indicating that Rick had been receiving payments from a local criminal organization. David frowned. Is this real? Or are they trying to manipulate me? Rick's breaking point. Meanwhile, Rick sat at home, lost in thought. He knew he was cornered. He picked up the phone and called Mike. Mike, I'm not running from this. I'm not letting you or the others pile more dirt onto this. Are you crazy? Mike shouted. If you confess, not only is your career over, but mine too. You want to drag everyone down? Rick took a deep breath. Maybe it's time someone broke the cycle. A public reckoning. The next morning, a press conference was called. David stood at the podium, with Rick standing beside him. All cameras were focused on the two. David began. We are here today to address a crisis of trust in our department. The video from the Daniels case has brought to light issues that must be resolved. And today, Officer Rick Calloway has decided to take an important step. Rick stepped forward, the microphone trembling in his hand. I made mistakes, he began, his voice wavering. Mistakes I can no longer hide from. What you saw in that video was wrong, and I take full responsibility. The journalists erupted with questions, but Rick raised his hand. This doesn't end with me. There's more in the system that needs to change, and I'm willing to cooperate with the investigation to ensure that happens. As Rick spoke, David couldn't ignore the documents he had received the night before. He still wasn't sure if the financial records were legitimate, but he decided to hold on to them, for now. A private confrontation. After the press conference, David confronted Rick in private. Is there something you need to tell me about your connection to the local criminal organization? Rick looked genuinely confused. What are you talking about? David realized he might have been deceived. Perhaps the folder was part of a scheme to discredit him. Regardless, he thought, I won't stray from my goal. Rick was suspended and faced an internal trial. But instead of fighting back, he chose to fully cooperate, exposing other issues within the department. His confession led to a sweeping cleanup, with several officers being removed from their positions. David, in turn, began to gain recognition for his integrity and determination. But he knew his fight was far from over. He gazed out the window of his office, reflecting on Rick's words. Not everything is black and white, he murmured to himself. But that doesn't mean we should stop fighting for justice.